When I saw him enter my home office unannounced, I didn't think twice. He always forgot something, his glasses, his charger, his wallet. But this time, he didn't speak. He walked straight to my desk, picked up my phone, and began scrolling. My heart didn't race because of guilt. It raced because I had forgotten to delete the messages. Those messages. I stepped forward, instinctively reaching for the phone, but he raised his arm slightly, silently refusing. His brows furrowed as his thumb swiped, reading line by line. I watched the disbelief on his face deepen, the quiet unraveling of everything I had built with a single careless omission. Yes, he was about to discover the truth. But not all of it. My body tensed as he hovered near the message that would break him. The one that would expose everything. Or maybe confuse him even more. My phone suddenly buzzed in his hand, a new notification lit up the screen. I saw his face go pale when he read the sender's name. He stood frozen, eyes locked to the screen, not even blinking. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit from childhood I never quite outgrew. Nerves mixed with dread, drowning my senses. I heard his breath, sharp and unsteady, from across the room. And in that moment, I knew this was what I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One that changed everything. Let me tell you how it all happened. But before I reveal the secret I tried so desperately to keep, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this. Have you ever had a secret that you tried to hide with all your strength, but in the end, failed? He moved in on a rainy Tuesday morning. Boxes stacked neatly near the entrance, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and a quiet nod of appreciation as he stepped into the hallway. My husband didn't come to help, he left for the office early, citing back-to-back meetings. I knew better. He hadn't asked about my day in weeks, hadn't touched me in longer than I cared to admit. So when my sister asked if her son could stay for a few months while completing his internship nearby, I agreed before the sentence was even finished. The guest room wasn't large, but I had prepared it like a hotel suite. Crisp sheets, folded towels, and a small plant on the windowsill to make it feel less temporary. He didn't say much as he unpacked. We exchanged a few polite words. It had been years since I'd seen him, he was just a teenager then. Now he was a man. Taller than I remembered, more thoughtful, more restrained. At first, we barely crossed paths. He left early for work, came back late, disappeared into his room. But on the third night, I heard him in the kitchen, struggling with the espresso machine. I offered help, and that's when we had our first real conversation. He told me about his job, about how hard it was to be taken seriously. I listened, really listened, and he noticed. It was subtle, the way he looked at me when I asked a question no one else would have thought to ask. We began working late together. He offered to assist with a presentation I was preparing for an upcoming conference. It was supposed to be one evening. It turned into 3. Then a week. We'd sit in my home office, him on the floor with his laptop, me at the desk. There were pauses, long ones. Sometimes we didn't speak at all, but the silence was never uncomfortable. One night, he leaned back and said, "You're good at what you do." Like, really good. I've never seen anyone manage pressure like that. I laughed, brushing it off, but the compliment lingered long after he left the room. My husband hadn't noticed my work in years. He didn't ask about my goals or offer praise. He used to, maybe. I don't even remember when it stopped. Maybe when I stopped expecting it. 2 weeks in, he started cooking occasionally. "You need to eat something that's not in a box," he said, placing a plate of pasta in front of me. I smiled but didn't argue. It tasted like someone cared. That night, I sat in bed longer than usual, awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling something I hadn't felt in ages, a pulse beneath the numbness. I didn't dress differently. Not consciously. But I began noticing how I looked in mirrors again. I wore the perfume I used to love. I chose earrings that shimmered in the light. It wasn't for him, I told myself. It was for me. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. One evening, he asked to borrow one of my old psychology books. "You're the only one I can really talk to," he said. His words caught me off guard. I smiled, pretending to be composed. But inside, I felt warm, flustered. Needed. Seen. The tension between us wasn't overt. It lived in glances, in the way our hands almost touched when passing a glass. In the way he sometimes looked at me after saying something, like he was waiting for a signal he didn't dare ask for. I told myself I was imagining things. I was a married woman. He was family, even if by marriage and distance. And yet, every day the line blurred a little more. One Saturday afternoon, my husband returned home early. He walked in, saw us sitting at the kitchen island, laughing over something trivial, and narrowed his eyes. "What's so funny?" he asked flatly. I felt the mood shift like a drop in barometric pressure. My voice caught in my throat. "Just work stuff," I muttered. He nodded, turned away. That night, he didn't speak to me. The silence was loud. Later, I found myself standing at the edge of the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. I could hear typing. I didn't go in. I stood there for several minutes, listening, trying to understand what I wanted. Not from him, from myself. It wasn't about attraction. Or at least, not only. It was about connection. The kind I used to have with my husband, when we stayed up talking at 2 a.m. about nothing and everything. The kind I thought I no longer deserved. The next day, I passed by the hallway mirror. I paused. And for the first time in years, I looked myself in the eyes. Not the woman people saw at meetings or dinner parties. The woman beneath the layers. I didn't recognize her. But I wanted to. I didn't know then what path I was stepping onto. I didn't know the cost. But I knew I was already walking it. The evening started like any other. I was sitting at the desk in my office, eyes blurred from staring too long at spreadsheets and presentation drafts. He stepped in quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea, mine with mint, just the way I liked it. I didn't hear him at first. The scent caught my attention before the sound of the cup meeting the wood did. I looked up and smiled, a tired, grateful curve of the lips. He didn't say much. He rarely did when he knew I was overworked. Instead, he sat on the floor near the window, laptop open on his knees, legs crossed, head tilted as he reviewed the slides we'd been adjusting together all week. There was something comforting about his presence. No expectations. No forced conversations. Just ease. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of my desk lamp and the fading light through the window. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently, and every so often, I could hear the low hum of passing cars. The quiet was rich. Not empty. At some point, I pushed my chair back and stretched, groaning a little at the stiffness in my back. He glanced up, smirked faintly, and without a word, stood and came around to my side. He reached for my shoulders gently, then paused, unsure if the gesture would be welcome. I didn't stop him. I didn't lean away. He placed his hands firmly but carefully on my shoulders and began to massage, slow and deliberate. My breath hitched, but I said nothing. The tension in my muscles began to ease, but another kind of tension took its place, quieter, deeper, unspoken. His touch wasn't suggestive. It was thoughtful, attentive. And that was what undid me. That someone noticed. That someone cared in such a small, human way. When he stopped, I turned slightly in the chair, enough for our eyes to meet. For a second too long. Neither of us blinked. We kissed. It was brief. Gentle. Nothing wild or dramatic. But it held everything. Every silent moment. Every charged glance. Every skipped heartbeat and held breath. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even intentional. It just happened. We pulled away at the same time. No words were spoken. He looked down, then stepped back, muttering something about needing air. I sat frozen, pulse pounding in my ears, 1,000 thoughts crashing into one another. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to my husband, who was already asleep, breathing evenly, arm flung across his chest. He hadn't asked about my day. Hadn't noticed the shift in me. Hadn't cared that I'd been home late. He hadn't cared for years. And I had pretended not to care that he didn't. Now, though, pretending felt impossible. The next morning was colder than usual. The air had a bite to it, the kind that makes your skin prickle under clothes. I made coffee, watching it brew like it might answer something I couldn't articulate. He walked in, hair damp from the shower, said a soft morning, and reached past me for his travel mug. His hand brushed mine. I flinched. He didn't notice. He left 10 minutes later, Ty Askew, phone already pressed to his ear. I watched from the window as his car pulled out of the driveway, the brake lights blinking like punctuation marks to a sentence I no longer believed. Later, while cleaning the kitchen, I knocked over a glass. It shattered across the floor. I stared at it for a full minute before moving. The shards reminded me of something. Of everything. By the time I returned to my office, he was already there, rearranging folders, his expression unreadable. I wanted to speak. To say something, anything, that would make it less awkward. But my throat refused. Instead, I sat at the desk and we began to work. Just like before. As if nothing had happened. But everything had. Every glance now felt loaded. Every word, carefully chosen. He kept his distance, physically and emotionally. I did the same. It was safer. More appropriate. More manageable. But it wasn't real. The day stretched endlessly. Deadlines loomed. Calls came in. Emails buzzed. Yet everything felt distant. Like background noise. The only thing I truly registered was his presence. The way he didn't look at me unless absolutely necessary. The way he avoided the space beside my chair. That night, I sat in the living room, glass of wine in hand, staring at the fireplace, though there was no fire. My husband sat across the room, scrolling through his phone. The television was on, but neither of us watched. The silence was thick. Suffocating. Finally, I said, "Do you remember when we used to talk?" He glanced up, surprised, as if I had interrupted something vital. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. "Just talk. About anything. Everything. Do you remember that?" He shrugged. "We're both busy. Life's complicated." I nodded slowly. He returned to his phone. And that was it. No questions. No curiosity. No reaching out. I finished the wine, placed the empty glass on the table, and stood. He didn't look up. In the hallway, I paused outside the guest room. The light was off. The door closed. I didn't knock. I didn't go in. But I stood there for a long time. Eventually, I returned to my own room. I undressed slowly, methodically, as though each layer might peel away the guilt, the confusion, the ache. I slipped under the covers and stared at the ceiling again. I thought of the kiss. Of the way it had startled me, not just because it happened, but because of what it meant. It wasn't about attraction. It wasn't about desire. It was about being seen. About being held in someone's awareness. And I realized how starved I was for that. I had gone so long without being touched, truly touched, not just physically but emotionally, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like. Forgotten that I was still a woman. Still alive. And now, I couldn't unfeel it. The next day, we spoke only about work. He didn't linger in the room. He didn't offer tea. And I didn't ask. But something had shifted. Something had cracked open. And no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, we both knew. We had crossed a line. I thought that keeping a measured distance would be enough. That if I focused solely on my work and responsibilities, the tension would dissolve like steam from a forgotten kettle. But life, I was quickly reminded, doesn't obey logic, nor does it soften the sharp edges of unresolved feelings simply because we choose to ignore them. Monday morning arrived with a bite in the air and a persistent drizzle that made everything look washed out and tired. My husband left early again, not bothering with a proper goodbye, just a muttered, distracted, "Have a good one." I stood by the window, watching his car pull away, a small splash from the curb rising as the tires rolled through a puddle. I didn't wave. He wouldn't have seen. By the time I entered my home office, he was already there. The young man I had kissed. He didn't look at me when I walked in. His posture was more rigid than usual, his jaw tighter. I mirrored his silence, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. We worked like that for nearly an hour, two bodies in a room, each occupied with their tasks but aware of the other in the way one feels a thunderstorm before it breaks. Eventually, the silence became unbearable. I cleared my throat and asked if he could join me on a site visit I had planned for that afternoon. There was a client an hour out of town, a last-minute request to evaluate their new training facility. Normally I would have gone alone, but I wanted a buffer, a context, a reason to be near him without being in the intimacy of my house. He agreed with a quiet nod, and by noon we were on the road. The rain had lightened, now just a fine mist that blurred the windshield and softened the edges of the trees along the highway. Inside the car, the atmosphere was dense. He fiddled with the air vents, adjusted the radio twice, then turned it off. I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, but I felt the weight of his presence like an invisible thread pulling against my spine. The meeting at the facility went smoothly. We toured the space, made notes, asked the right questions. From the outside, we looked like any efficient professional team, focused, composed. But beneath the surface, every glance, every brush of movement in narrow hallways was heightened, charged with something we both refused to name. On the drive back, the weather shifted. The sky darkened quickly, clouds heavy with promise. Wind picked up, and not long after, the first bolt of lightning cracked across the horizon. Traffic slowed, and a flashing sign warned of a closure ahead. We detoured onto a smaller road, unfamiliar and winding, bordered by thick woods and scattered homes. Just as I voiced concern about fuel, the engine stuttered. Then it died. We coasted to the side of the road, near a weathered gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the attendant informed us they'd had electrical issues all week and couldn't restart the pump. There was a small motel next door. A single row of doors under a corrugated metal awning. Vacancy sign buzzing in red. I booked a room without thinking too much. The rain was now a downpour, and neither of us had eaten. The woman behind the counter handed me a key and offered a plastic bag with 2 microwavable meals and 2 sodas. It felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life. The room was small and dim. 1 bed. A worn table. curtains with a pattern that might have once been cheerful. He set his bag down, then immediately offered to walk back to the car for my charger. I didn't stop him. When he returned, I had already kicked off my shoes and was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through emails. He placed the charger beside me but didn't sit. Instead, he opened the window slightly, letting in a thread of cool air. For a long while, we said nothing. Eventually, he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. I felt his gaze, but I couldn't bring myself to meet it. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said quietly. "You don't have to." "I know. But I will." I nodded, though he couldn't see it from where he stood. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the faint light from the bathroom. That night was unlike any other. We didn't touch. We didn't speak. He lay on the floor with his jacket as a pillow, eyes closed but not asleep. I stayed on the bed, curled on my side, listening to the rain beat against the window, the occasional creak of the old pipes in the walls. At some point, I sat up. My thoughts were loud. I wanted to apologize, to explain, to say something that might make things easier. But words felt too fragile, too dangerous. I whispered his name, but he didn't move. When morning came, the rain had stopped. The world outside was gray and glistening. We packed in silence, dropped the key in the box at the front desk, and returned to the car. The gas station was still closed, but a tow truck happened to pass by. We flagged it down and arranged for help. By noon, we were back home. As we stood in the driveway, the tension between us still taut, he looked at me for the first time in hours. "We should keep things simple," he said. I nodded again. Yes. But there was nothing simple about any of it. He walked inside first. I followed a few minutes later, pretending to check the mailbox. When I entered the kitchen, he was already gone, retreated to his room. My husband arrived home later than usual that night. He greeted me with the same detached warmth he always used. Asked if I'd eaten. I said yes. He commented on the weather. I nodded. It was all familiar. All practiced. And yet, after everything, it felt like another language. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about that small motel room, the silence, the restraint. I thought about how something can be both completely innocent and profoundly irreversible at the same time. And I knew then, this was not the end of it. We had not outrun the storm. We had only driven through the eye of it. The days that followed were marked by a delicate choreography of avoidance. We moved around each other with precision, as if one wrong glance or an accidental brush of the hand might crack the thin layer of civility we'd managed to preserve. He left earlier for work, returned later, spent more time in his room. I, in turn, buried myself in client calls, spreadsheets, and meaningless tasks that gave the illusion of normalcy. At night, I lay beside my husband, staring at the ceiling, the hush of our bedroom now louder than any argument could have been. He asked fewer questions than ever, though to be fair, there had never been many. I was beginning to realize how long we had coasted on silence, on routine, on the convenience of simply not addressing the drift between us. His presence in my life had become more of a placeholder than a partnership. And I had let it happen. One Wednesday afternoon, I received an unexpected email from a client requesting a last-minute consultation at their branch office 2 hours out of town. I accepted without hesitation. I needed the space, the excuse to step away from the house, from the air that felt too heavy, from the unspoken truths clinging to every wall. When I mentioned it over dinner, my husband barely looked up from his phone. "That's good," he said. "It'll be nice to get out." He didn't ask where or with whom. As I packed my bag that evening, I heard a soft knock at my door. It opened slightly, and he stepped in, hands in his pockets, eyes uncertain. He hadn't come to my office in days. We hadn't exchanged more than surface-level words since the motel. He cleared his throat. Do you need help tomorrow? With the trip? I paused, unsure how to respond. There was no logistical need for him to come, but something in his voice wasn't about logistics. It was about proximity. About connection. About trying. After a moment, I nodded. You can come. He gave a small, grateful nod, then left the room before I could say anything else. The drive was quiet, but not strained. The rain had finally stopped, and the sky was a soft, even gray. The road stretched out ahead of us, winding gently through fields and small towns. We didn't talk much, but the silence felt different this time, not avoidant, but respectful. When we arrived, the meeting went smoothly. He handled himself professionally, chiming in at the right moments, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. I watched him from across the table, noticing how composed he had become, how confident in ways he hadn't been weeks ago. Afterward, we stopped at a small cafe to grab something to eat. It was nothing fancy, a couple of sandwiches, coffee in paper cups, but the simplicity of it grounded me. We sat by the window, watching passers-by on the street, each absorbed in their own world. I found myself relaxing for the first time in days. On the drive home, we passed a bookstore, and I impulsively pulled over. 5 minutes, I said, stepping out before he could respond. I needed to move, to be around words and pages and the scent of paper. He followed me in without question. Inside, I wandered through the aisles, fingers trailing along spines. In the corner of the store was a small shelf labeled Staff Picks. One title caught my eye, a novel I hadn't read in years. I picked it up, flipping through pages, and felt a nudge beside me. I've never seen you this calm, he said quietly. I looked at him. It's easier around books. They don't talk back. He smiled, but there was a sadness behind it. One I didn't address. Back in the car, the mood had shifted. The clouds had thickened, casting a dull haze over the road. We drove in near silence for 20 minutes until I pulled off onto a scenic overlook I'd passed many times but never stopped at. The view was nothing dramatic, just open fields rolling into a line of trees, but it felt vast, untouched. We got out, leaned against the railing, the wind cool against our faces. For a long while, we said nothing. Then, without turning to me, he spoke. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to. He continued, I respect you. I really do. But I'm also confused. I nodded slowly. You're not the only one. A gust of wind blew through the trees below. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the cold bite into my skin. When I opened them, he was looking at me, not the way he had in the past, not with hesitation or question, but with something steadier. A kind of quiet understanding. I turned back toward the car. We should go. The rest of the drive was wordless. That night, I entered the house first. My husband was home, sitting on the couch, laptop on his knees. He glanced up briefly. Long day? Yeah, I said, hanging up my coat. He didn't ask for details. Later, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked the same hair, same face, same lines near my eyes, but I felt different. Like something internal had been rearranged, shifted just enough to change the way I carried myself. As I brushed my hair, I thought about the way he had looked at me at the overlook. The restraint, the respect. The complexity of it. Nothing had happened between us that day, not in the physical sense, but it felt like something had still changed. It wasn't desire that clung to me now. It was grief. Grief for the woman I had once been. For the marriage I had tried to maintain with glue and silence. for the connections I hadn't nurtured because I had forgotten how. When I slipped under the covers, my husband was already asleep. I stared at the ceiling, fingers clasped over my stomach, as if holding something in. And for the first time, I allowed myself to say it, not aloud, not in action, but in quiet admission to myself. I wasn't happy. And I didn't know how much longer I could pretend that I was. The weather shifted again, as if the air itself sensed something unspoken hanging between us. Mornings were colder now, the wind sharper, the sunlight more fleeting. I noticed it during my walks to the mailbox, in the way the light slanted through the trees and cast long, narrow shadows across the lawn. Something in the season echoed what was happening inside me, a quiet unraveling. At home, the atmosphere had thinned to the point of transparency. My husband and I passed one another like faint outlines, barely speaking, barely even acknowledging each other's presence. We shared the same roof, the same routines, but not the same world. And we hadn't for a long time. Still, I maintained appearances. I kept the house in order. I responded to work emails. I prepared dinner, even if I knew he would eat late or elsewhere. I folded laundry. I watered plants. I moved through the motions like someone watching herself from above, wondering what, exactly, she was holding on to. And then came the weekend. Saturday morning brought a brief reprieve from routine. I had been invited to attend a small business seminar hosted by a client in a nearby city. It was short, just a few hours of networking, followed by a cocktail mixer in the early evening. I debated going alone, but when I mentioned it in passing to him over coffee, he offered to come without hesitation. I didn't say yes right away. I looked at him carefully, trying to read something in his face. Not an ulterior motive, not expectation, just intent. But his expression was neutral, steady. He simply said, "You might want company." That's all. So I agreed. We drove in quiet comfort, the kind that had once been awkward but now settled like a blanket between us. The event was held in a boutique hotel on the edge of the city, an elegant, modern space with tall windows and muted decor. We arrived early, signed in, received our name tags, and found seats in the middle of the conference room. Throughout the seminar, he remained engaged, scribbling notes, nodding during the more insightful panels. I, on the other hand, found it difficult to concentrate. My thoughts wandered. I observed the way he leaned forward slightly when a speaker caught his interest. The way he looked at me when I asked a question and someone on stage responded thoughtfully, as if proud of the way I held my ground. We shared glances that said nothing and everything all at once. When the seminar ended, we stepped out onto the hotel terrace to breathe. The sky was tinged with the gold and violet hues of dusk. I leaned on the railing, the city spread out beneath us like a quiet promise. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets. I was about to suggest we leave when one of the coordinators approached and asked if we were staying for the mixer. I hadn't planned to. But before I could answer, he looked at me and said gently, "Maybe for a little while?" We stayed. The mixer was held in a lounge on the hotel's top floor. Low lighting, soft music, clusters of people sipping wine and exchanging polite conversation. He fetched us drinks, sparkling water for me, a glass of red for himself, and we found a corner near the window. The city lights had begun to flicker on, one by one, like cautious admissions of nightfall. People passed by and greeted us, asked questions, shared business cards. I smiled, nodded, spoke when appropriate, but my focus remained on the subtle weight of his presence beside me. When the room grew too warm, I stepped away toward the balcony. He followed a few minutes later, and we stood in silence again, the air crisp now, the buzz of voices behind us softened by the glass. I looked at him and said, "Thank you for coming." He nodded once. "I'm glad I did." There was a pause. Then we kissed. It was simple. Undramatic. But deeply human. Not out of passion or recklessness, but out of recognition. A momentary surrender to something that had been growing between us slowly, quietly, despite every effort to resist. When it ended, we both looked away. Not in shame. Not in confusion. But in something closer to acceptance. We left the event shortly after. The drive home was different from the one that brought us there. The silence held a kind of reverence, as if the night itself had witnessed what happened and chose not to speak of it. I watched the road while he watched the trees blur past. Neither of us reached for the radio. At the house, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the hallway light. He followed, paused at the entrance to the kitchen, and waited. I turned to face him, and for a moment, we stood in the stillness again. Then he said, quietly, "Good night." "Good night," I answered. He went to his room. I stood in the hallway, listening to his footsteps, then walked slowly up the stairs to mine. My husband wasn't home. He hadn't messaged. I didn't expect him to. I sat on the edge of the bed, removed my earrings, folded my blazer, and placed it on the chair near the window. The city's distant glow shimmered on the glass. I touched my lips with the back of my fingers, as if confirming that it had really happened. I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilt. What I felt was harder to define, something like grief, but not over the kiss. Over the years that led to it. Over the emptiness that had quietly taken root in the space where love once lived. Over the way I had let myself disappear. I lay down, pulled the blanket over me, and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, it was deep. Untroubled. Not because everything was right. But because, for the first time, I wasn't pretending. The days after the kiss were a blur of tasks completed with mechanical precision. I moved through my responsibilities as if each one were a stone to be placed carefully in a wall I was trying to rebuild around myself. There was no confrontation, no fallout, no sudden implosion. And yet, everything felt altered. Not in the dramatic way movies portray, but in the quiet discomfort that seeps into a room where something unspoken has been acknowledged. He didn't bring it up. Neither did I. We continued to work together as we had before, though now our interactions were laced with a fragile kind of awareness. Eye contact was avoided or held too long. Words were measured. Distance was respected almost religiously. At home, my husband returned to his usual patterns, late nights at the office, quick showers before bed, a kiss on the cheek that had more obligation than warmth. He didn't ask where I had been that night of the mixer. He didn't even seem to remember it had happened. Part of me wondered if he had long since given up wondering about my whereabouts, the way I had stopped asking about his. It was on a Thursday morning that I noticed the shift in him. He was humming while making coffee, tapping his fingers along the countertop like he hadn't done in years. I watched from the hallway for a moment before stepping into the kitchen. He looked up, smiled, an unfamiliar expression on his face. "I might go away this weekend," he said, casually, as if it were something he said all the time. "Where?" I asked, not because I wanted to know, but because it felt expected. "Just a retreat," he replied, sipping his coffee. "A few colleagues. Spa, hiking. That sort of thing." I nodded, not pushing further. I had no claim to his time. We had become independent entities sharing a mutual address. What struck me wasn't his answer, it was the way he had already packed a small overnight bag leaning by the front door. He left the next evening without much ceremony. I watched his car pull away, the taillights vanishing into the early dark. I stood by the window longer than necessary, not because I was upset, but because I felt nothing. No sense of loss. No anger. Just space. Later that night, I made a simple dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table. The silence wasn't heavy. It was neutral, almost soothing. I washed my plate, dried it, and placed it back in the cupboard with a deliberateness that made the act feel sacred. Around 9, there was a soft knock at the door. I knew it was him before I opened it. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, his eyes tired but steady. He didn't speak. Neither did I. I stepped aside, and he entered. He didn't ask about my husband. I didn't explain his absence. We sat in the living room, not too close, not too far, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock our only companions. The lamp cast a warm light across the room, catching the edges of picture frames and bookshelves. It felt like the safest space I'd been in for weeks. He spoke first. "I've been thinking about leaving the internship early," he said. "Maybe heading back home. Looking for something else." I swallowed the lump that rose in my throat. "Why?" He looked down at his hands. "Because I don't want to complicate your life." I let that sit between us for a while before replying. "It's already complicated." He gave a soft laugh. Not bitter. Not amused. Just resigned. I wanted to say more, but I didn't know how to articulate what was stirring in me. I wasn't sure if it was guilt, or fear, or grief over the years I had spent buried in routine, pretending I didn't need more. Maybe it was all of that. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that, for the first time, someone had seen me as more than a role I played. He stood eventually, moving toward the door. I followed him without thinking. At the doorway, he paused. The light from the hallway flickered slightly above him. "I'm not running away," he said. "I just don't want to be a mistake you regret." I looked at him and felt a pressure in my chest, not of shame, but of clarity. "You're not a mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "None of this is a mistake. It's just hard." He nodded once. "Take care of yourself." "You too." He left, and I didn't close the door right away. I stood there, feeling the cool air rush in. The hallway light continued its soft flicker, like a distant pulse. I spent the rest of the weekend alone. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check emails. I walked around the neighborhood, browsed a farmer's market, sat on a park bench with a book I didn't really read. I allowed myself to just exist, something I hadn't done in years without guilt or the pressure to perform. When Sunday evening came, I made dinner again, this time with more care. I lit a candle, not for atmosphere but because I wanted to. I set the table for one and ate slowly. No distractions. No noise. That night, I wrote in a journal I hadn't touched in over a decade. I didn't write about him. Or my husband. I wrote about myself, what I remembered loving, what I missed, what I feared. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't even coherent. But it was mine. When my husband returned late that night, I was already in bed, lights off, eyes open. He didn't say much. Just climbed in beside me and turned away. I didn't ask where he'd been. He didn't offer. But the space between us wasn't just physical anymore. It was intentional. And it was growing. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. After he left that evening, quiet, steady, almost graceful in his retreat, I assumed he meant it. That he'd vanish slowly from my life, slipping into memory rather than remaining in proximity. I told myself it was for the best. That silence would help me regain control. That distance would erase the ache that had settled in my chest, low and dull, like a bruise you forget until you stretch too far. But life doesn't always follow our assumptions. Sometimes it crashes through them with quiet precision. A week passed. My husband remained distant, though something in his demeanor had shifted. He was more attentive, not in affection, but in caution. He studied me when he thought I wasn't looking. His questions became less casual, more deliberate. He lingered in doorways. He asked about meetings he never cared about before. I recognized the signs. Not jealousy. Not regret. But suspicion. And yet, he said nothing directly. I responded with the same strategy. Careful normalcy. Measured tone. Pleasant disinterest. On Friday morning, my calendar reminded me of a corporate leadership retreat I had RSVP'd to months earlier. I'd forgotten about it entirely. It was out of town, a 2-day event at a lakeside hotel, designed for mid-level executives to recharge, network, and attend development workshops. Normally I would have declined, but something compelled me to go. Maybe the idea of a quiet hotel room appealed to me more than anything else. I packed lightly and left early, telling my husband I'd be back Sunday evening. He nodded, didn't ask more. He rarely did anymore. The drive was uneventful, long stretches of road flanked by pine and birch, the occasional gas station or diner breaking the landscape. I arrived at the hotel mid-afternoon. It was beautiful in a minimal way, natural wood, glass walls, the lake visible from nearly every corner. Check-in was smooth. My room overlooked the water. I stood by the window for a long time after setting down my bag, letting the silence fill me. There was a welcome dinner that evening in a large conference room turned dining hall. Round tables, soft lighting, name tags. I moved through conversations politely, answering questions about my department, discussing recent projects, nodding at all the right moments. It was muscle memory. At some point between courses, I excused myself and stepped outside to the terrace. The lake was calm, its surface smooth like glass. The sky had just begun to darken, the first stars blinking through the fading dusk. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool air, letting it settle something restless in me. And then I heard a voice behind me. "Didn't expect to see you here." I turned. My heart didn't race. It didn't leap or drop. It just slowed. As if pausing to understand the moment. He stood there in a dark sweater and jeans, his name tag half peeled at the corner, hands in his pockets, hair tousled from the wind. I didn't ask why he was there. I didn't have to. He was a smart young professional working under a major mentorship program. Of course he'd been invited. The universe hadn't arranged some cruel twist. It had simply aligned in a way I hadn't anticipated. We stood silently for a while. There was nothing theatrical in the moment. Just recognition. Just gravity. Eventually, I said, "I thought you were leaving early." He shrugged slightly. "Changed my mind." "Why?" He looked past me toward the lake. "Didn't want to run away from something just because it scared me." I let that sit in the air between us. We didn't talk much more. We returned inside separately, sat at different tables. But something had been acknowledged again, softly, like a door gently unlatched, not opened. The next day was a blur of workshops and breakout sessions. I moved through them with practiced ease, engaging in discussions, taking notes I likely wouldn't read later. But my attention kept drifting. Not just to him, though that was part of it, but to myself. To the space I had inhabited for so long, professionally competent, emotionally numb. Late that afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled in. The rain came in sudden bursts, tapping against windows, drumming against the roof. The final session was cut short, and attendees scattered to their rooms or the cozy hotel lounge. I returned to my room, grateful for the excuse to be alone. I made tea, pulled on a sweater, and sat on the small couch by the window. The lake had disappeared behind the fog and rain, the view now a blur of movement and sound. I closed my eyes and let it soothe me. I must have dozed off. I woke to a knock at the door. For a moment, I didn't move. Then I rose slowly and opened it. He stood there, damp from the rain, holding 2 cups of coffee. He offered one without a word. I stepped aside, and he entered. We didn't speak much. He handed me the cup, then sat in the chair across from me. The rain had softened, now a quiet tapping instead of a roar. The room smelled of wood, coffee, and the faint scent of the lake. I don't remember who said what first. The conversation unfolded gradually. We talked about work, about books we were reading, about things we missed from our childhood. It wasn't charged or tense. It was gentle. Honest. At some point, the silence returned. Not heavy. Just present. And then, without ceremony or drama, we spent the night together. Not with fireworks. Not with passion fueled by recklessness. But with stillness. With the understanding that something had shifted again, not in body, but in being. In choice. In truth. The next morning, he left early. No long goodbye. No promises. Just a soft, unspoken agreement. That nothing would be the same. And that maybe, that was okay. The return home felt quieter than the drive out, though nothing about the car or the road had changed. The engine hummed the same low rhythm, the tires traced familiar asphalt, but inside me, something had rearranged. I sat behind the wheel with both hands steady, eyes fixed on the stretch of highway, yet my mind was somewhere else entirely. He had left before sunrise, his absence announced only by the folded blanket on the couch and the faint scent of his cologne in the air. There were no notes, no parting words. I hadn't expected any. What passed between us didn't require explanation, it existed in the kind of silence that spoke for itself. A mutual knowing. A line that had been crossed not recklessly, but consciously, after everything had already eroded beneath it. The lake, the rain, the way the room had held us, it all felt distant now, like a fragment of someone else's story. And yet, I carried it home like a weight tucked inside my ribs. Not heavy, not shameful. Just real. When I stepped back into the house that evening, it was warm, dim, and still. My husband's shoes were by the door, his jacket tossed over the arm of the chair. He was upstairs, judging by the soft creak of the floorboards overhead. I didn't call out. I set my bag down in the hallway, took off my coat, and moved into the kitchen. The routine returned automatically, kettle filled, stove lit, mug selected, tea bag placed inside. These small acts felt like anchors, reminders that life would continue whether or not I understood what direction it had taken. Steam began to rise, curling into the air like a slow exhale. He came down not long after, freshly showered, wearing the robe I'd bought him last Christmas. He greeted me with a vague smile, the kind used between strangers who've shared too many meals in silence. "How was it?" he asked, pouring himself a glass of water. "Productive," I said. He nodded, taking a slow sip. "You look tired." "It was a full schedule." Another nod. No more questions. We ate dinner with the television on, tuned to a program neither of us watched. He commented on the news once. I responded with something neutral. The meal ended. Dishes were washed. Lights were turned off. We went to bed like we always did, side by side, but worlds apart. I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, tracing the familiar cracks in the plaster. I thought about how routine can disguise the hollow spaces underneath. How two people can live parallel lives in the same square footage, never truly colliding. I turned on my side, facing the wall, and let my eyes close, not because I was ready to sleep, but because I was too tired to keep them open. The next morning, the sun spilled through the window with more confidence than I felt. I moved through the motions: shower, clothes, coffee, emails. At some point, I walked past the guest room, the one that had once been his. It was quiet. Clean. The bed made, the desk clear. He hadn't returned since the retreat. And I didn't know if he would. That afternoon, I sat in my office trying to complete a proposal. I stared at the same paragraph for nearly an hour, rewriting, deleting, rewording again. My thoughts refused to settle. Eventually, I closed the document and leaned back in my chair. Everything felt paused. My phone buzzed once, an email notification from a client. Then another buzz, this time a message. It was from my husband. Out late. Dinner with a few people from work. No name. No details. Just a statement. I stared at the screen, reread the message twice, then set the phone face down on the desk. The silence in the house returned quickly after that. I made myself a simple dinner. Ate alone. Washed my plate. Turned on the radio just to fill the space. And then I did something I hadn't done in months. I walked up to the attic. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no impulse driving me, just a quiet urge to be somewhere that hadn't been touched in a long time. The attic was where we stored the remnants of our early years, boxes of books, old furniture, decorations from holidays we no longer celebrated with enthusiasm. It smelled of dust and wood and the faint mustiness of forgotten time. I sat on an old bench, wrapped my arms around my knees, and let my thoughts wander. At some point, I pulled out a box labeled Memories. Inside were photos, vacations, birthdays, early anniversaries. Us, smiling, arms around each other, cheeks flushed with youth and something resembling hope. I studied one picture in particular, taken on a trip to the coast. We were standing in front of the water, wind whipping my hair, his arm around my shoulder. We looked happy. But memory, I knew, was a selective thing. I placed the photo back in the box and closed the lid slowly. That version of us was still here, in theory. But theories rarely hold up under reality's weight. As I descended the attic steps, a strange calm settled over me. Not peace, exactly, but a sense of readiness. Something was shifting inside, preparing itself for honesty. That night, he came home late, as promised. I was reading in the living room, a blanket over my lap, a half-finished cup of tea beside me. He entered quietly, removed his shoes, and glanced in my direction. "You're up," he said. I couldn't sleep. He sat in the armchair across from me, loosening his tie. His eyes were tired. His voice, flat. "It's been a long week." I nodded. "Yes. It has." We didn't speak for a while. The space between us held the unasked questions neither of us had the courage to voice. Then he said, "Is something going on?" The question landed softly, but it echoed. I didn't react right away. I closed the book slowly, placed it on the table, and met his eyes. Would it matter if there was? He hesitated. It might. But would it change anything? His silence answered for him. He looked away, then back again. "We're both tired." "Yes," I said. "We are." He stood, not angrily, not urgently. "I'm going to bed. I'll be up soon." He left the room, and I remained in the silence. Not broken. Not whole. But something else entirely. Aware. The morning began with silence. Not the heavy kind, nor the strained kind, but the kind that arrives when something essential has already been said, wordlessly or otherwise. I awoke to the soft sound of rain tapping against the windows, the air cool and still around me. My husband was already gone. The other side of the bed was cold, the imprint of his weight faded. A note on the kitchen counter read, simply, left early. See you tonight. There was no signature. Just a brief line of ink, like an obligation fulfilled. I moved slowly through the morning. Shower, coffee, breakfast I didn't finish. My eyes kept drifting to the window, where the trees outside swayed with the breeze. I felt a strange looseness in my chest, as though something had finally given way. There was no dramatic break, no explosion of emotion. Just a quiet knowing. The story we were in was reaching its end, and both of us had started turning the pages more slowly, not because we were afraid of what came next, but because we already knew. Work couldn't hold my attention. I answered emails, reviewed documents, sat through a virtual meeting with my team, nodding in the right places, offering suggestions when called upon. But beneath the surface, something kept pulling at me. A need not to escape, but to reflect. To make sense of what had unfolded over these last weeks, not just what happened, but what it had revealed. By noon, I found myself in the car, driving with no specific destination in mind. The city passed by in muted colors, gray skies, wet pavement, people tucked into coats and umbrellas. I turned down a side street without thinking, and only realized where I was headed when I pulled into the small bookstore near the park. A place I hadn't been in years. Inside, the air smelled of old pages and floor polish. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and the woman at the counter offered a polite smile. I nodded back, then wandered through the aisles, fingertips trailing the spines of novels and poetry collections. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. It felt like being in a museum of other people's thoughts, and I welcomed the anonymity. Eventually, I found a book, something by an author I'd always meant to read, and carried it to the counter. As the clerk rang it up, I glanced out the window. A familiar figure was standing across the street. He hadn't seen me. He was staring into the window of a cafe, shoulders hunched slightly against the drizzle, hands in his coat pockets. I didn't wave. I didn't call out. I simply stood there, holding the book, watching him through the glass. It wasn't sadness that came over me. It wasn't longing, either. It was recognition. Of him. Of myself. Of everything that had passed between us. I left the store through the side door and walked through the park instead. The air smelled of wet leaves and earth. I passed a bench where I had once sat years ago with my husband, back when we still reached for each other's hands without thinking. The memory surfaced briefly, uninvited, then receded. By the time I returned home, it was late afternoon. The light had softened, casting long shadows across the walls. I made tea, then took it to the back porch and sat with a blanket draped over my legs. The garden had started to shift into its late autumn form, colors dulling, leaves scattering, stems bowing under the weight of time. I thought of how things decay slowly, not all at once. How the breaking often happens invisibly, over months, years. And how sometimes it takes a single moment to make you realize it's already broken. The back door creaked open an hour later. My husband stepped out, holding his own cup. He sat across from me, neither of us speaking for a while. The sound of birds filled the silence between us. Then, without turning to face me, he asked, "Do you still love me?" It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't desperate. It was just curious. I looked at him, studied his profile, the familiar lines, the quiet exhaustion in his eyes. "I don't know," I answered. He nodded once, slowly. "Fair enough." There was no anger in him. No hurt, even. Only resignation. And maybe, under that, relief. I could have said more. I could have brought up the things we'd stopped doing, the conversations we stopped having, the way we both learned to live next to one another rather than with each other. But I didn't. Because he already knew. You? I asked. He turned to look at me for the first time. I haven't for a while, he said. I just didn't want to admit it. The air between us felt lighter after that. Not because anything had been fixed, but because the weight of pretending had finally lifted. What do we do now? I asked. He shrugged. I don't know. Maybe we stop pretending. Start being honest. Whatever that means. We sat for a while longer. Then he stood, placed his cup on the table, and went back inside. I remained on the porch, watching the last of the daylight fade. My fingers tightened around the mug in my hands, holding on to the warmth for just a little longer. Later that evening, I found the envelope. It had been slid under my office door. My name was written on the front in careful, familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter. Handwritten. Quiet. Thoughtful. He had left town. Not forever. But for now. He needed space, he wrote. To figure out who he was without me, and who he might become. He didn't ask for anything. No promises. No explanations. Just, thank you. For the honesty. For the parts of myself I had shared with him. He ended the letter with one line. Whatever this was, it mattered. Even if no one else ever knows. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Then I sat at my desk, closed my eyes, and breathed. Not because I had reached peace. But because, for the first time, I had stopped running from the truth. The days that followed unfolded in soft, quiet motion, no announcements, no decisions carved in stone, just small shifts in rhythm that slowly, inevitably, changed everything. There were no arguments, no confrontations, no grand resolutions. But the air in the house had changed. We both knew it. My husband and I continued to share space, but not a life. We moved around each other with a kind of mutual understanding, an unspoken agreement to let things unravel gently rather than force a final tear. He began sleeping in the guest room under the pretense of working late and not wanting to disturb me. I didn't question it. I didn't challenge him. In truth, it was a relief. It gave both of us permission to breathe. One evening, I found myself sitting in the living room long after the sun had gone down, wrapped in a blanket with a journal in my lap. I hadn't written in years, not like this. Not for myself. The pen moved slowly at first, unsure of its voice, then with more confidence. I wrote not about him, or the one who left the letter, but about myself. About who I had become, and how quietly it had happened. I didn't cry. I didn't feel shame. What I felt was a kind of gratitude. For clarity. For a version of truth that wasn't neat or pretty, but honest. And I needed that more than I'd realized. The next morning, I made a decision. One that had been forming quietly in the background for weeks. I called my supervisor and requested a leave of absence, just a few weeks. Time to reset. To reassess. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "Take care of yourself." With the sudden openness in my schedule, I filled my days with things I had long abandoned. I walked without a destination. I cooked for the sake of taste, not obligation. I read books I had stacked on shelves for years. I called old friends and didn't pretend everything was perfect. And, slowly, I began to move through the house differently. Not as a wife. Not as a hostess. But as myself. I cleared out closets. Donated clothes that no longer felt like mine. Rearranged the kitchen cabinets. Bought new curtains. These were small things, perhaps even invisible from the outside, but to me, they mattered. My husband noticed, but said nothing. Our conversations, when they happened, were polite and brief. Occasionally, I caught him watching me with a kind of distant curiosity, like he was trying to remember the woman he once married and not quite recognizing who sat before him. He never asked about the letter. I never offered. One afternoon, I went to the lake. It was the same one from the retreat, though now the season had changed. The trees were bare, the air sharp, the sky layered in a low-hanging gray. I sat on a bench near the edge, scarf wrapped tightly around my neck, hands buried in my coat pockets. I didn't expect him to be there. I didn't look for him. That part of the story had already closed itself. But I returned anyway, not to chase what had passed, but to sit inside the memory without needing to relive it. To reclaim it as mine. I stayed there for over an hour, watching the wind ripple the surface of the water, leaves skimming across in uneven lines. I thought about how things change without our permission. How the people we once couldn't imagine life without sometimes become chapters in a story that we continue without them. On my way back, I stopped by a small art gallery tucked into a side street. It was nearly empty, and I wandered through the space quietly, absorbing the colors, the brushstrokes, the silence between canvases. One painting held me longer than the rest, a landscape of a single road cutting through an empty field under a golden sky. There was something lonely and hopeful in it at once. I stood there for a long time, hands clasped in front of me, until the clerk approached and offered a soft smile. "It's a favorite of mine," she said. "It feels like something's ending, but not in a sad way." I nodded. "Yes. Like something's just beginning." I didn't buy the painting. But I carried it with me. When I returned home that evening, the house was quiet. My husband's car was gone. A note on the fridge read, "Gone to stay with a friend for a while. We'll talk soon." I folded the note in half and placed it in the drawer next to the stove. There was no sadness. No shock. Just a sense of space finally created. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning out the office. The one we once shared in quiet collaboration. The one where everything had started to shift. I boxed up papers, filed away what mattered, and discarded what didn't. I rearranged the shelves. Lit a candle. Opened the window. The night air was cool against my skin. It smelled of earth and wind and the faint promise of rain. Later, I stood in the hallway, staring at the guest room door. I opened it slowly. The room was still neat, still untouched. The bed made. The desk clear. But it no longer felt like a room waiting for someone. It felt like part of the house again. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't have a map for what life would look like from here. But for the first time, that didn't scare me. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter again. I unfolded it, smoothed the creases, and read it one more time. Whatever this was, it mattered. I traced the words with my fingertip. Then I refolded the paper and placed it in a small wooden box on the nightstand. A keepsake, not an anchor. I turned off the light, stepped out of the room, and gently closed the door behind me. Then I walked into the living room, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat by the window, watching the wind pull at the trees. Not waiting. Not regretting. Just being.